Open up your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 4. And we're going to continue our series here this morning that Peter has been teaching and writing this letter. This letter has been written to Jewish people who have gotten saved. They are now followers of Jesus, and they have experienced at some level persecution at home. Wherever they were from, they experienced persecution, and so they began to move on. They wind up in the Roman Empire, and it starts off as fairly easy to live there. It begins pretty easily for them, but it begins to transition as Nero, who's leading during this time, who's Caesar, begins to do incredibly more and more irrational and crazy things, and it culminates with Christians being killed and tortured. So this is the group that Peter is writing to, ones that experience all kinds of things, and they're suffering. This is what we're going to be talking more about this morning, as Peter is challenging these folks with how do we deal with suffering? How do we deal with hard things in life? Every person in here experiences hardships. You experience difficulties. It can be things like the loss of a loved one. It can be illness. It can be the loss of a job. The economy's downturn. It can be poverty. It can be all kinds of different things that we can experience. Now, I listed some of these like major things that can happen. Some of them can be much smaller things. But in the moment, you feel like you are suffering. There's one event every year that I would describe. It's very mild suffering, but it is suffering. It's called TLC. It's our teenagers' winter camp. And the suffering is for the leaders that have to go with teenagers on an overnight trip. And I know that every single year, for years that I went, and we would drive right after Christmas. We would go through the snow, go through the ice, the craziness of the kids. And we would get to this camp, and I knew that God was going to do some amazing things in the lives of the kids. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but think it would be so much nicer to be warm and at home and in bed and not here. Not in this room that's going to smell horrific in the next couple of days, with teenage boys that are going to act wild and crazy the entire time. There is this minute little bit of suffering. One of the things that I would do is, in my mind, I would sit there and just say something very simply, because I knew that the trip would go by so quickly. And in the end, it would end up being a very good experience. And so I would sit there and just think, you know what, by this time in 2 days, it's going to just go by so quick, and we're going to be gone. And so we would make a decision every year to make the best of the moments that we had. Whether they were difficult or whether they were a blast and amazing, we wanted to make the most of these moments. I was listening to a gentleman this week online. He is a retired Navy SEAL. I'm not going to mention the guy's name. He's he's a motivational speaker. He does that kind of stuff. But boy, he literally cusses like a sailor. But I remember something he was saying about suffering as he went through the Navy SEALs training. He said that training, that BUDS training and what they call Hell Week, is just the beginning. And he talks about this. He said a lot of people fixate on this week as if it's some heroic accomplishment. He said it's nothing. It's the beginning step of a career where your entire life is suffering. And he began to talk about it, and he said the only way that he has found to get through these moments of suffering is he thinks about the comfort that he could be in, and he looks at that, and he said his brain will become rational when he's looking at the suffering from this real weird kind of abstract view. And he said by fixating on the hope of the future, It allows him to get through the suffering of the moments. And he shared how that helped him through BUD/S training and through all of this military training. And it brought my mind to this passage that we're going to look at. Because ultimately, Peter is doing the same thing. He's pointing to the future for Christians, and he's telling them that in the suffering, look to what's coming. In the midst of suffering, look to what God is going to do. And not only for your life today here, but in eternity. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're going to start on verse 1 here. Someone asked this morning, I guess in the foyer, was curious. For those that want to know, I read out of the LSB Bible, the Legacy Standard Bible, for those that are interested. This is a word-for-word translation. Other ones, just to give a quick kind of explanation of what this is, you have a spectrum of Bible translations. On the far end, which is a thought for thought, they're trying to get the general idea of what's going on. You have the NLT. It's the New Living Translation. This is a thought for thought. And then in the middle, you have things like New King James, NIV. I know that's sacrilege for some to put those two near each other, but those are kind of in the middle. And then on the far side, you have LSB and NASB, some of these translations, which are called literal translations. This is why I've shared with some of our volunteers and church staff, it sometimes sounds like Yoda's reading the Bible, Yoda from Star Wars, but it's because it's a literal translation. So let's look at verse 1 together. It says, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to no longer live the rest of the time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have worked out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries." The first point that Peter is making here that we're going to walk through here is live the life that you have left, not shackled by the empty promises of this world. This is what Peter is outlining here. He's saying, therefore, which points us back to what took place in chapter 3 at the very end of 18 through 22, and Peter's using kind of confusing language about Jesus going down into Hades or down into hell and preaching to the prisoners. And then he's vindicated and resurrected and lifted up to the right hand of the Father. But in this language, what he's sharing is that Christ suffered in his body physically, that the humanity of Christ suffered. He experienced incredible suffering, and he died for us. And he didn't just stay dead, he was resurrected. And now he is the authority above everything. Everything is under subjection to Christ. And Peter is teaching them this because he just taught them that, listen, you're going to live in a world with all kinds of authority. You're going to live in a world with government authority. You're going to live in a world with bosses. You're going to live in a world where there's marriages. And there's authority in all of these areas, and they're broken. These systems are broken. And here is how you live as a believer, even in the midst of broken systems. And then it culminates with this great encouragement. But Jesus, who suffered, has conquered death, is at the right hand of the Father, and now everything is subject to him. That's the therefore here at the beginning. Therefore, because of all of those reasons. And then Peter goes on to share that we are to arm ourselves with the same thinking, the same attitude of Christ? Is your mind, is your head, is your thinking, is your heart aligned with that of Christ? The word that Peter uses here for arm yourself is the exact same language used when a military is preparing for war. Imagine this image here of someone gearing up for battle. It's the Navy SEAL that's being deployed, that's been through training, that's disciplined, that's lived a life of discipline and grit and suffering, but now is ready for battle and is arming themselves and being prepared. And Peter's language is to arm ourselves, that we are prepared to suffer in the same ways that Christ suffered, which may be physically in our bodies like Christ did. It will most certainly be in the area of rejection. That if you live as Christ lived, you will be rejected by a culture that rejects that kind of thinking. And so Peter's response is to prepare yourselves as soldiers for battle. And the point that he's making is that if you are willing to suffer for Christ, if you are willing to live in such a way that you are letting go of all of these things that have captured your hearts, that this will be evidence that your heart belongs to the Lord, not to the world. So what drives your heart? What drives your existence? What drives your thinking? This is what Peter is getting at. Is your heart so connected to your living for the political systems of the world? Or you're living for financial success? Or you're living for just the perfect life? See, this is what Peter is saying. This is part of the world's systems. This is how the world thinks. This is the attitude of the world. Instead, have the attitude of Christ. Prepare yourself for suffering. Well, that doesn't sound like fun. I want to prepare myself for suffering. And ultimately, he says, not that this is a sinless, perfect life, but that your heart is not captured and controlled by sin. See, we complicate sin by attributing sin to behaviors. Like, oh, they're sinners. Look at that person. They're swearing or they're drinking or they're doing whatever. It's not the behavior. It's the heart attitude. It's what has captured your heart. Have you surrendered your life to Christ? See, what all of this boils down to is, are you living your life for you, or are you living your life for Christ? This is what it boils down to completely. Who are you living your life for? And when we live it for self, Scripture refers to that as sin. Verse 2, Peter gives this statement that we're to be ready so as to live. This is the statement that he's making. Be prepared to suffer so as to live in this certain way, in this obedience to Christ. And he challenges the people that are reading this, that for you have already experienced the emptiness of sin. It's amazing. He lists this list of things. He mentions the desire of the Gentiles, the things that they want. And we can read this and think, well, Gentiles, this isn't about me, or this doesn't connect to me, or this isn't about me. Gentiles is a generic term for unbelievers. So Peter's contrasting the way a believer should live versus how an unbeliever lives. And he lists them out very clearly. That someone who's a believer, their heart should have their heart and attitudes aligned with Christ, and they should be focused on living for Christ. And people who are living in the world have a different way that they process and think about this world. And he lists these areas. He gives this listing of sensuality and lusts. Peter is calling out sexual sin, in whatever capacity that it shows up. The Bible talks specifically about things like adultery, homosexuality. They use the word porneia, which is where we get the word porn from. This word is talking about sexual activity outside of the design of what God has intended. And so Peter is mentioning these things that unbelievers, they don't care. They do whatever feels right. They do whatever they think feels good in that moment. He also mentions drunkenness, carousing, and drinking parties. These three are listed together. This right here I know can cause some challenge or concern in the hearts of believers. I want to tell you, I've studied and gone through for years this debate that's been had about whether drinking is a sin. I don't find anywhere in the scriptures that specifically call it out as a sin, but what Peter is doing is talking about a lifestyle surrounded by drinking. It's what he's dealing with. It's not just the consumption of alcohol, it's a life where you center yourself around it. This is a statement against drunkenness. That's any kind of drunkenness. If you're drunk, if you're an alcoholic, Peter is speaking directly against that, saying that this is the way unbelievers live. And he mentions carousing and drinking parties. Ultimately, what Peter is dealing with is a social life centered around this kind of worldview. And we know what this looks like. We've been around people like this, that their entire social structure, how they live their lives, is centered around getting together with friends and drinking the whole time. We can't wait to go to hunting camp, not because we're hunting, but because we're getting together so we can go drink in the woods. This is what Peter is speaking against specifically. And he's saying this kind of attitude is the way that unbelievers live, not believers. And he's drawing a very clear distinction. And then he ends with abominable idolatries. This is an unholy and profane lifestyle. And remember, idolatries, everything in life, every sin, every wrong attitude, every wrong heart position that is not in line with Christ is idolatry. That is the root sin that we all have. Every person in this room, including me, has idolatry issues. Where there are things in our lives that we have placed above Christ. There are things in our lives, attitudes, thoughts, behaviors that are not aligned with the attitudes and the thinking of Christ. And this is what Peter is driving home, to get your attitudes, get your hearts aligned with Christ. And when this happens, when you arm yourselves in this way, the behavior is going to follow. You're going to look more and more like Jesus and less like the world. We're going to look at verses 4 and 5, and we're going to see very quickly how the world responds, or the unbelievers respond. It says, in all of this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, maligning you. But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. What a powerful couple of verses. The second point here this morning is that people who have placed their hope in the world cannot understand those who have rejected it. And we know this. I was talking to an individual yesterday. I had left here and had to run a couple of errands while we were doing setup and decorating for VBS. And I ran into someone that lives in another town. Their family is all in this area. They're a Christian. They've been going to church forever. But their family lives exactly what Peter is saying the world lives like. These are believers, Christians who live for the weekend so that they can go all gather around bonfires getting drunk. That is how they live while proclaiming Christ. And this individual, while we were sitting there talking, is telling me that this just is not his way of doing life. That he loves his family. He wants to spend time with them, but he wants to participate in none of these things. He was outright rejecting them. And he wasn't being unkind. He wasn't going after his family and telling them what awful people they were. He was making a decision to live differently. And he was beginning by telling me a story about going to a family function while everyone was there and doing what they always do, and he declined. And he said for the next hour he was mocked for not willing to participate in how they chose to live. And he began to share about how that burdened his heart. And this is what Peter is pointing to. He's dealing with these things. And he's saying that because of all of this and all of this stuff, because you don't live this way, because you have put on and armed yourselves with the attitude of Christ, you are not living this way anymore. And because of it, those who continue to live this way, whether they are unsaved or whether they are Christians living like they are unsaved, that they turn and will mock you. And why? Because you no longer share the values and aspirations that they do. See, this is the roots of the whole thing. And Peter says that they're surprised. They look at you who say, I'm going to live differently. I don't want to live like the world is living. And it says that they are surprised, like they're startled, like you're the weirdo. You're the one that's odd. And they look at you this way because you're choosing to live differently. See, those that are living for the values of the Gentiles, those are the things that Peter pointed out. Living for sensuality, for lusts, living for drunkenness, living for carousing, living for drinking parties. This kind of living is how the unsaved live, because they don't know any difference. And so they live this way, not knowing the gospel. But those of us that have been saved and redeemed by the gospel know differently. And they're surprised because we have forsaken the cultural norm of the day. And Peter says that they will give an account. This is the reality of it. Church, this is what Scripture is telling us, is that there will be an account for how we live. That we will stand before the Father and we will give an account. And this is specifically true for those who are lost and who are unsaved. They have rejected Christ. And instead of serving Christ, they serve the flesh. They serve the lust of the world. They serve what feels good. And they live their entire lives with this in mind. And Peter's saying that they will give an account. And he's pointing towards, it's an eschatological argument. He's looking at the end times. That's what eschatology means. He's looking at the end. When it's all said and done. When Jesus, the one and only authority, is judging, those who have rejected him will give an account. And you who live in the light instead of the darkness will be elevated in that moment. What a powerful reality. Let's look at verse 6 here. It says, "For to this the gospel has been proclaimed, even to those who are now dead, so that though they were judged in the flesh as men, they live in the spirits according to the will of God." love this letter that Peter has written. But I will tell you this. Peter writes some challenging things sometimes. And not just challenging in the sense, so when you tear apart this letter and you look at it, a lot of people have accused Paul of run-on sentences. That's like all of Peter. It's like one big run-on thought that he gives. And he gives some things that are mildly confusing to people. We looked at Martin Luther, who quoted last week of saying, I have no idea what 1 Peter 3:18-22 says, and I have no idea what it means. There's some of the great thinkers of our world struggling with the meaning of some of these things, and this is one of those passages that have caused people to stumble from time to time. And so what Peter is sharing here, Peter is dealing with a world where people are pushing back on his thinking. He's talking about what it means to have an attitude that follows Christ, that believes Christ, that's willing to suffer and die to the flesh. And he's talking about in the end times that you will be judged accordingly. And the world around him, the unbelievers, are saying, what are you talking about? There are people who are Christians and non-Christians, and they all have the same end. They all die. This is what's being pushed against Peter and other believers. That it doesn't matter how you live, you're going to die anyway, so you might as well live to enjoy life, to live it to the fullest. You never know when it's going to end, so do what you want and do what feels good now. This is the attitude that is surrounding Peter. And Peter deals with this. He says, for the gospel has been proclaimed to those who are now dead. So those that heard the gospel, responded to the gospel, that their bodies have died. He's saying so that they were judged in the flesh as men, that they are still under the judgment of Adam. Sin comes into the world and created death for all of humanity. Peter is just simply pointing to this, that all of us, so they're men. Becoming a Christian doesn't mean you're not human. They're human like the rest of us, and they will experience death. But here is the kicker that Peter gives. But they live in the spirits according to the will of God. This is the gospel that Peter has been preaching, been teaching, and been challenging. The gospel of Jesus is for all people. That's our third point here. And this is what Peter has been telling all of these people. That yes, death comes for us all, but for those of us who follow Jesus, it is not the end of our story. It is not the end. And that's what he continues to put and points towards. This passage begins with the word for. For to this, the gospel. He's pointing forward. That the people have rejected Christ and are mocking him and saying that all men die, that all men go this direction. And he says, for to the gospel has been proclaimed. And he points to the hope in the gospel. And that death is not the final word. Believers will die just like unbelievers, but they live spiritually. Let's look at verse 7 here. Peter now transitions to having a view of the end in mind. He's sharing with all of these people, how do we live? How do we function in this world? And now he's living and pointing towards the end. And in verse 7 it says, the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be of sound thinking and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. We are to live as if today could be our last. This is our fourth point. You and I are not promised tomorrow. This is the reality. Death comes for every person in this room. I don't know for you when it's going to be. I hope we all live to a ripe old age. But the reality is, that doesn't happen for a lot of people. There are people that go to bed and don't wake up the next morning. There's kids that are driving on the street late at night, get into an accident, and they're gone, and they're in their 20s. There are people that are sick and dying all around us. We don't know how many days we have on this planet. I remember, it's been a while ago, but a handful of years ago, I got really sick and was septic. I didn't realize how close that I had come to death. As I was sitting in the hospital, I was incoherent for about a week, had no knowledge of what was going on. I remember going into the hospital, and they rushed me up to a room, and then I was gone. And I have no memory for about a week. The next memory that I have was, of all things, an elder of our church, Rod Smith, bedside with me praying. That was my next memory about a week after I wound up there. After I came to, my wife and the nurses and others were there, and those of you who know me know that I can be a bit of a jokester. And there were people coming into the room, and I was trying to lighten the mood. And we had Pastor John at the time came in to visit, and he asked me how I was feeling. And I said, I just needed a vacation, so I took time off. Kind of dismissed it. And then the nurse began to chastise me, and she said, you have no idea how close you were to death. And told me minimum, at best case scenario, we thought you were 50-50 for days. I had no clue. The truth is, we don't know when our last is going to come. We don't know whether we have 20 years, 40 years, 60, 80. We don't know how many years we have to live. And Peter's challenge is that the end is near. Keep the end in mind. When Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected, he ascended to the right hand of the Father. This means the end times are here. This is the culmination of a new period of time on this planet, which is known as the end of time. I don't know whether it's 1,000 years are left or whether 10 years are left, but I can tell you this, we are in the last chapter. That is what culminated at the cross. And so Peter is pointing to that, saying, live with this in mind, that we don't know how long we have. The end is near. Peter is reminding us to live with this in mind. I want to give a warning as well that having this mindset, knowing that we're in the last chapter, that we're nearing the end. Again, this is called eschatology. This is the study of the end times. And just because we look at this and we know that we're in the end times, one of the temptations is that we become fascinated with finding dates and times. Well, the Lord's going to come in this day and this time. And we begin to watch for signs, that I'm looking for specific signs, and I'm watching every moment of it. I'm going to tell everyone that this sign happened. You could be gone tomorrow, and you could be under judgment then. We live in this weird place, and I want you to know that an understanding of living, knowing that life is precious, that there's not much time, there is less time ahead of us than there is behind us. Living from this perspective is not about picking dates and times, but about a living as people who are Christians. And that we live according to our convictions. That we don't say we're followers of Jesus, but live as Peter described that the world lives. We live with a heart and an attitude of Christ, knowing that the end is near. Let's look at verse 8. It says, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one has received a gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. The fifth point this morning is that true freedom and fulfillment are found in love and service. See, Peter is highlighting the emptiness of the world. And he said that all of us have had enough time to experience the truth of this. We've all lived in the flesh. We have all made decisions to embrace the way of living that the Gentiles do. And as Christians, we can tell you that it is empty. This is what Peter is saying. And so you know it's empty. You've had plenty of time to live with the heart and the attitude of Christ. And that freedom and fulfillment are found in love and service, not only to God, but to one another. It says to keep fervent in your love. Love is the central theme of Christianity. And I know we struggle with it so much that we don't show love very often. We show ugliness and judgment, nastiness. That happens so easy. 1 Corinthians 13, Paul is writing this chapter on love. You hear it quoted at weddings and read there all the time, but it's not about marriage necessarily. It's about the church. It's about how believers are supposed to live together. And in Matthew, it teaches in Matthew 22 about hearts that are to love. And Jesus in Matthew 24:12 teaches us about the end times and says, and because lawlessness is multiplied, and he's referencing the end times, most people's love will grow cold. This should be a central theme for us, that we're to love each other, to love God, to love our world around us. Proverbs 10:12 says, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all transgressions. And in James 5:20 it says, let him know that he who turns the sinner from the error of his ways will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. See, love covers a multitude of sins. Think about this with each other. Think about this in your marriage. I love my wife and she loves me, but I know for a fact that I annoy her to no end some days. But when my wife loves me and chooses to live in that love, it can cover a lot of those annoyances, a lot of those small things. And see, we as Christians should be operating in the same way, that we love each other dearly. It is so much easier to overlook mistakes and issues and challenges when we truly love each other dearly. And Peter challenges us to be hospitable without complaints. Hebrews 13, verses 2 and 3 says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember the prisoners as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you yourselves also are in the body. Peter reminds us to show hospitality without complaints. This is to welcome people. And I want to give you kind of this understanding of the culture of the day. See, for Christians in this world, they were being run out of their homes. They were escaping with their lives and had to leave all their possessions behind. And so Peter is challenging this community. When you have believers show up, welcome them. Bring them into your home. Help them get established in life. This is what's going on in this. They also had pastors and preachers, apostles that would travel through, and they would go into a community, and there weren't a large group of hotels that they could book in and take up a hotel for a few days. And it was about being hospitable to give a place for someone to stay who's doing the work of the ministry. This statement is not about opening your home to every person in the church with no boundaries. This is not about opening your home for the church lady that complains all the time and is showing up just to pick you apart because you didn't clean your house right. This has nothing to do with that. This is about how we love each other, that we're to care for one another, and that when you see a genuine need, you respond to the genuine need. When someone's in the hospital, go visit them. When someone, maybe they're sick or they're dealing with illness and they're struggling to cook for themselves, that doesn't mean you have to invite them into your home. Bring a meal to them. This is what Peter is getting at, that we can act in a way that's hospitable to love and encourage one another. And then he mentions in verse 10 the gifts of the Spirit, or the special gift. He says, and each one has received a gift. Employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. You have been given a gift. Paul details these in 1 Corinthians 12, and we're not going to go into all of them. And in Ephesians 4, he tells us the purpose of the gifts. That you are here at Emmanuel. You are here and part of our church. And the reason why you're here, God has given you gifts and abilities, a spiritual gift, at least one. Some of us may have a couple of them, but there's at least a spiritual gift that God has given you. And the reason that God has given it to you is to build up the body of Christ. It is so that you can minister to one another and encourage one another so that hearts and attitudes and lives align with Christ. This is the purpose of our spiritual gifts. And we are called to be good stewards. This is to manage our spiritual gifts. Verse 11 says this, whoever speaks is one speaking the oracles of God. Whoever serves is one serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and might forever and ever. Amen. Final point this morning is we are all called to be ministers. These gifts are broken down into two basic categories. These aren't the details, but these are categories. There's the speaking gifts and the serving gifts. And Peter is saying if you have a speaking gift, this could be a teacher, this could be someone on stage for preaching, for other things, if this is your teaching gift or preaching gift or some kind of speaking gift, you may be teaching first grade Sunday school, but God has gifted you in this. And the challenge that Peter says is take it seriously that the words that you're giving are as if you're giving the words of God. And if you have the serving gifts, this manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Maybe you have an expertise in finances or administration. Maybe you're behind the scenes, you like serving. There are people in our church that have been through every square inch of the walls of this building, in between running wires and doing all kinds of things. And they don't want to ever be mentioned. They don't want their names known. There are people that show up at fundraisers at 115-degree heat for 4th of July and spend hours cleaning up, tearing things down, working incredibly hard. See, these are still spiritual gifts that they're exercising. Just because they're not teaching or preaching, they're utilizing it in other ways. And Peter is saying, do that as if you were serving the Lord directly. We are to use great care in using our spiritual gifts. Peter concludes this little portion with what's called a doxology, which is a moment of praise. He takes a moment to thank God for how amazing He is. I want to end this morning to give a few things to maybe challenge yourself with. I'm going to give you several. And I'm not telling you to go work on all of these all week long, but I want to challenge you to pick one. Allow the Lord to challenge your heart about what area you need to grow in. The areas that maybe the scriptures that Peter is teaching out of, that he is writing here, can challenge your hearts. The first one is discipline and grit. As soldiers, we're called to arm ourselves. Are you doing that? Are you disciplined in your time in the Word, in prayer, fellowship with other believers, going to church, worshiping? Maybe you need to grow in your discipline and grit. Purposeful living. About aligning your daily actions to the will of God. That God, let me live today not as if it's just a mundane day, but that I don't know how many days I have left. Let me live each one to your glory. Could be community and accountability. Maybe you show up to church, you hear a message, you go home, and you want no relationships. And Peter and Paul and all throughout the Bible would challenge us that community is so important. And so maybe you need to join a small group. Maybe you need to connect with someone, make an effort, go talk to someone and say, let's go out to grab lunch or let's go get coffee and build relationships. All of us can work on this, but maybe you need to witness through your lifestyle. Maybe there are days that you're struggling, that you live more like a Gentile than you do a follower of Jesus, and that you need the Lord to change your heart, that you would follow and obey Him, and that you would make a decision to distance yourself from the sins that you've used to live and engage in, but instead to be obedient to the Lord. Maybe you need to grow in the area of hospitality without complaint. I want to encourage you to bring a meal to someone. Send a card, a note. Tell someone you're thinking about them and praying for them. And the last one is the stewardship of your spiritual gifts. Maybe you need to learn what your spiritual gift is and to begin to use it for God's glory.